Welcome to this deep dive. We've got quite a stack of notes here, transcripts from a conversation that really jumps around.
It does, yeah, from like individual stories all the way up to global finance and AI even.
Exactly. So our job today, for you, is to unpack all this, pull out the main ideas, see how the sources connect these, well, seemingly different things.
And try to figure out what picture they're painting about, where things stand economically, societally.
Right. It's interesting how they start small, isn't it? The notes kick off mentioning things like that Vrije Ondernemen in Netherlands
Yes,
website.
a platform for business owners sharing frustrations, dealing with government, local rules, that sort of thing.
Just highlighting that friction, that everyday struggle.
Mm-hmm. And then it shifts quite dramatically to a personal story. Someone named Freak facing a really serious health issue, aggressive lung cancer, young age.
And this is where the sources, well, they present a very specific viewpoint. They link these kinds of severe health problems to potential vaccine side effects.
And the idea of a suppressed immune system. They bring up this concept that our bodies are constantly fighting off rogue cells.
Like the idea, you technically get cancer multiple times a day,
Yeah.
but your immune system just deals with it normally.
Exactly. And the perspective presented is if that system's weakened for whatever reason they suggest, then it can't do its job.
The sources then sort of broaden out from this personal story.
Yeah, they argue there's not enough open discussion about potential links, between things like sudden heart problems or these aggressive cancers and, well, possible side effects.
They feel it's not really being talked about in the mainstream.
Though they do quickly mention some action happening elsewhere. Like in the US, apparently someone named Kennedy is recommending against certain COVID vaccines for younger people, pregnant women.
So that's the perspective in the source material, that these are questions needing more open discussion. And these initial points, the friction, the health concerns, they're kind of the gateway, aren't they?
Yeah, it's like they're setting the stage, showing stress points at the individual level before zooming out to the big picture.
And that big picture has some dramatic framing in the sources.
Yeah.
The end is here, or the end of the road.
Right. This idea that we're at a fundamental crossroads for the whole economic system.
This comes up after mentions of Robert Kiyosaki,
Yeah.
Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Yeah, that classic contrast. Working for money versus having your money work for you.
Investing in assets, right?
Yeah.
Real estate, gold, silver, Bitcoin, that kind of thing. Not just saving cash.
And the sources pick up on this, the idea that standard education doesn't teach this financial literacy.
And that this lack of understanding kind of traps people, keeps them from seeing how the system really operates.
So how does that tie into the end of the road? Well, the sources then get into government finance. How do governments pay for everything, especially deficits?
They issue debt, government bonds, basically IOUs.
Exactly. Selling them to, big players, wealthy people, pension funds, other institutions, and increasingly central banks.
And these bonds pay interest, right? You buy a bond, the government pays you, say, 4% a year for 10 years, then gives you your original money back. Simple enough.
On the surface, yeah. But the sources argue, here's the crunch point. What happens when demand for these bonds dries up?
They mention examples, Japan, the U.S., where bond auctions were weak, like nobody showed up, metaphorically speaking.
Well, basic economics, right? Low demand means the price falls.
Okay.
But with bonds, it's a bit counterintuitive. A falling price means the yield, the effective interest rate for someone buying it now, goes up.
Ah, okay. So if a €1,000 bond paying 30 interest only sells for 800 secondhand, the buyer gets a better return.
Precisely. 30 divided by 800, that's 3.75% yield, not the original 3%.
And that's the problem for governments needing to borrow new money.
Exactly. They have to compete with those higher yields on the secondary market. So they want low rates, but weak demand forces rates higher anyway.
It sounds like a trap.
The sources call it an iron grip. They suggest this financial pressure is actually behind a lot of global issues. Wars, political shifts, climate policy debates, it all connects back to this, in their view.
Wow. And they argue that when the usual buyers, like pension funds, which they claim might be depleted or manipulated, aren't buying,
Then there's often only one buyer left with deep enough pockets.
the central bank.
Yep. And that leads to QE, quantitative easing, or monetary rooming as it's put.
Which the sources just flat out call the money printer.
Pretty much. The government issues bonds because it needs money. The central bank creates money out of thin air, digitally, buys the bonds, sticks them on its balance sheet.
They mention a technical difference between the Fed in the U.S. and the ECB in Europe, but say the result's the same.
Essentially, yeah. New money floods the system. And it gets worse, according to the sources,
How so?
because banks can then use those government bonds on their balance sheets as top-tier collateral, pristine collateral.
Meaning they can lend out even more money based on those bonds.
Exactly, leveraging it up so the initial money printing gets amplified.
And the consequence of all this extra money sloshing around.
Is that the money itself becomes worth less. Your dollar, your euro, buys fewer goods and services. That's inflation.
Which is terrible for anyone holding bonds, right? If inflation is higher than the interest rate they're getting.
They're losing purchasing power, making bonds even less attractive. It's a vicious circle.
So the sources paint a picture of the U.S. government being, what, silently bankrupt?
Yeah, the idea isn't that they can't print the dollars to pay the interest. It's that they can't pay it back with real economic value anymore, only with newly created devalued money.
And that secondary market we talked about just keeps reinforcing the problem. Falling confidence, people dumping bonds.
Pushing yields higher, making new government borrowing more and more expensive.
The sources also point a finger at Japan, saying they were a huge buyer of U.S. debt, but now have their own problems.
Right. If Japan faces hyperinflation or has to sell its U.S. bonds, that puts even more pressure on the U.S. market. It's all interconnected.
And Europe is seen as being on the same track, with the ECB buying up Eurozone debt.
That's the view presented. It's becoming a global phenomenon, this reliance on central banks buying government debt, a path leading, well, they don't mince words.
They mention historical examples: Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Weimar Germany.
Argentina, Cyprus, Turkey, Lebanon, Russia. Yeah, hyperinflation horror stories.
But the argument is, this time it's different, because it's happening to the big ones. The dollar, the euro.
That's the claim. It's unprecedented because it's global, affecting the core reserve currencies. And the dollar's role is crucial.
How so?
Well, if the dollar tanks, Americans buy fewer imports. So other countries, like in Europe, might feel forced to devalue their currencies too, make the euro cheaper.
How? By printing more euros.
Exactly. To stay competitive, exporting to the U.S., it becomes a global race to the bottom, currency-wise, feeding that vicious circle.
Okay, so this sounds pretty bleak. The sources say we're at a crucial crossroads. What are the paths forward they describe?
Well, path one is just keep it like this.
And where does that lead, according to them?
Towards a totalitarian communist state. They use examples like Venezuela, the Soviet Union, places where economic collapse led to massive state control.
Okay, what's path two?
Path two is just something else, doing something different, which leads into a discussion about MMT.
Modern money theory, or as the sources call it, the magic money tree.
Yeah, they're pretty dismissive. The MMT idea being that governments can just create infinite money and control any resulting inflation by taxing more.
And the critique in the sources is
That it doesn't work like that in reality. Higher taxes make people poorer, reduce actual production, then the government has to create make-work jobs, leading to more dependency, less real economic activity.
this connects to their discussion about AI, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. They explore this future where AI and robots could do, well, almost everything productive. Cooking, writing emails, farming, building things.
Which raises that huge question, what do humans do then?
Exactly. The sources mention the cynical view that maybe a lot of people just won't be needed, economically speaking.
And ideas like universal basic income, UBI, or just keeping people busy. They mention Harari's line about drugs and video games.
Right. But here's the really provocative point the sources make. They argue this isn't just some sci-fi future, it's already happening.
What do you mean?
They describe a lot of current work as, frankly, bullshit jobs, non-productive work. They even cite a statistic claiming maybe half the workers in the Netherlands are essentially government-funded and produce nothing tangible.
That's a strong claim. What examples do they give?
Things like AI could easily do the correspondence for government workers already working from home, or the whole digital nomad thing working remotely from, say, Thailand. The implication is a lot of people are already detached from core production, kind of like a hidden UBI.
They also bring up salary comparisons.
Yeah, pointing to relatively high salaries for certain government roles, like BOAs, compared to the private sector, and contrasting massive government project costs like the Binnenhof renovation with private construction costs like the Burj Khalifa.
So the argument is, this is the path to hell, resources and talent being sucked into non-productive state activity.
That's the perspective, yeah. It incentivizes working for the state or not working productively, hindering private business.
But then there's this twist, this really counterintuitive idea about AI.
Right. Just when you think AI is part of the problem making humans obsolete, The sources float the idea that AI and robots might actually be the solution to the debt crisis.
By creating massive productivity.
Exactly. A surge in productivity so huge that it actually generates enough real wealth to pay down those colossal government debts. Something human labor alone, even with immigration boosts like in the past, just can't achieve anymore.
That's quite a thought. That automation might save us from the consequences of the money printing.
It's definitely out there. They also briefly touch on what AI is now, like an advanced database, people wanting single answers, wanting it integrated into the OS. They note current limitations like Grok apparently being bad, and look ahead to more advanced AI.
Okay, so bringing it back down from these huge global and technological themes, what do the sources advise for you, the individual listener, navigating all this?
The main advice seems to be get out of saving in cash. Euros, dollars. These currencies are expected to lose purchasing power.
So save in assets instead.
Yes, stocks, gold, silver, Bitcoin, maybe property, things that aren't just digits the central bank can create more of. The idea is these hold value better against inflation.
They also mentioned something interesting about existing debt, like student loans or mortgages.
Yeah, this point that often gets missed. If the currency itself is devaluing significantly due to inflation, the real burden of your fixed debt actually decreases over time. You pay it back with cheaper money.
That's a key insight for those who understand the system, according to the sources.
Definitely. They also touch on official inflation stats, like the CPI, the Consumer Price Index.
Explain how that's calculated.
It uses a basket of goods and services over 1,100 items in the Netherlands, apparently. They track the price changes in that basket.
But the sources are skeptical about the official numbers.
Well, yeah. They present the viewpoint, neutrally of course, that governments want low reported inflation. It keeps their borrowing costs down.
So the suggestion is they might, let's say, adjust the basket or use quality adjustments.
Right. Like saying the new iPhone cost more, but it's so much better that it actually counts as deflation per unit of quality. Things like that, they argue. Keep the official rate near the 2% target, while your actual experience at the grocery store might feel like much higher inflation.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. We've gone through sources that connect individual frustrations.
To this core economic engine problem. Massive government debt, the difficulty financing it, leading to money creation.
Inflation and this potential systemic crisis or major transformation ahead.
We looked at the crossroads, described the path towards more state control versus something else.
Including that critique of MMT and the really fascinating, maybe paradoxical role AI could play.
Potentially solving the productivity problem needed to escape the debt trap, even as it changes the nature of work itself.
And for the individual, the advice seems to be about protecting your wealth by shifting away from fiat currency savings.
Moving into assets that might hold their value better in an inflationary environment.
It's a complex web, the sources weave, connecting personal finance, health, global economics, politics, and technology.
What really strikes me is how consistently they trace things back to that fundamental pressure point, government debt and how it's financed, seeing that as the driver for so much else.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over, drawing from all this. If these sources are right, even partly, about the trajectory of the economy and the potential impact of AI, what does work actually mean for you going forward?
Yeah, and how do you position yourself in a world where the old rules, the traditional systems of finance and labor might be fundamentally shifting under our feet?
Lots to think about. We do have some extra material we might touch on in a separate segment. Notes mentioned Ukraine, long-range weapons, Russia's actions.
Europe's role, the U.S. relationship, maybe that Corona Commission thing again, so more to explore there.
For now, though, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material.